Hello and welcome to Better Under Pressure. I'm Sara Milne Rowe, author of The Shed Method and founder of Coaching Impact. And in this podcast, I talk to leaders from all walks of life about being better under pressure and using pressure for better. I want to explore how we handle pressure in a world that is becoming more and more complex, the impact that pressure has on our ability to perform at our best, and what we do to be better under pressure.
Literally my second month in the role, we released our gender pay gap. Well, there was an enormous amount of feeling about it nationally, and it looks very stark. I think particularly in book publishing, where it's a predominantly female workforce, there was a lot of anger and frustration and pressure. I've always counted myself as a feminist ally. At the same time, I couldn't deny the fact I'm a white man sitting at the top of this organisation. I took it very deeply. People were so honest. Women in particular spoke about their experiences. It was a very painful and bruising process. Now I look back on that, it's like, wow, that was the most helpful and amazing thing. If I hadn't felt under that pressure, if I hadn't felt it that deeply, I feel like as a business, we wouldn't have improved things such a lot.
Today, I'm talking to David Shelley, Group CEO of Hachette UK, the second largest consumer publisher in the country. David's entire career has been in publishing. He started at independent publishers Allison and Busby, and in 2005 he joined Little Brown as editorial director. Initially commissioning with a focus on crime and thriller novels and overseeing the audio and ebook lists, he became publisher of their commercial imprint Sphere 2 years later, before becoming overall Little Brown publisher in 2011. He became CEO of Orion and Little Brown in 2015, and since January 2018 has been Hachette UK's Group CEO, as well as an officer of the Publishers Association. Authors he's published include Mitch Albom, Mark Billingham, Kyle Hyson, Dennis Lehane, Val McDermott and J.K. Rowling. In this conversation, he shares how he makes work not feel like work, how he uses storytelling in times of pressure, and what he does to pull back from strong feelings. David, thank you so much for joining me on Better Under Pressure.
It's a real pleasure, Sarah. Really happy to be here.
Let's kick off with, David, what does pressure mean to you?
I suppose over the years I've come to see pressure differently. I think I used to see it as external things that happen. I suppose, particularly in a work context, things that happen that make me feel stressed or put me in a certain frame of mind. I guess over particularly the last 5 or 6 years, I've come to see pressure more as internal pressure. So kind of just looking at myself, there can be something that I think externally can be happening that might seem very dramatic or big, but I'll feel quite calm about it. Or there can be something that other people will say, well, that was nothing, or, that really wasn't anything, but I will feel under a lot of pressure. So for me, I suppose pressure increasingly means kind of in my mind, kind of what makes me feel stressed or anxious or kind of gets the adrenaline going, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Okay, so let's start there. What does get your adrenaline going, David?
Well, and you know a lot of this well, because you know me, but I think a lot of it is about when I'm trying to put this without sounding too sort of childlike, but a lot of it is when I don't feel that I'm liked. That I feel under pressure. So if there's a situation where more than one person or a group of people are saying something that I take as sort of negative about myself, or that's sort of sending some sort of negative message to me about me, that I suppose puts me under some pressure. I feel under some pressure in those situations. Whereas, for instance, there can be something that's enormously big for the business.
Yes.
But if I'm not getting those sorts of personal reactions to it, then I can feel quite calm about it.
So. I love that honesty, David. I'm celebrating that honesty, that you as a CEO can say, do you know what? The pressure really hits me when I feel like someone doesn't like me, but it feels worse than that. I think it's something for me about you feeling isolated, that can sometimes kick that off. And, and I've seen you deal with some really mighty big business, external, what you might put in the external pressure bucket. And actually what you're saying to us here, and I think this is so relevant and so useful, particularly for people in very, very senior positions, that actually it's a bit tough sometimes when you're right up there and you feel like you haven't got the sort of support maybe of the people that you would rely on. Would that be fair?
I think that's right. I mean, I think sometimes conversely, pressure, it's interesting. I was thinking before I did this, pressure can be a positive thing as well. So there can be some other times when that sort of, hearing that from people or feeling that can actually be a constructive thing, I suppose. In terms...
Can you give examples of when, because you know me, I mean, I think pressure is a fantastic force for growth and development. But I suppose what this whole these conversations are trying to unearth, when does that tip into something that's unhelpful versus something that's actually very, enlivening. And so can you share some examples, some specific maybe examples of when it tips one way or the other for you, David?
And actually, if I kind of think back on examples, I mean, a lot of them tip both ways, I suppose.
Okay.
And I suppose I kind of learned that I have a bit of a process with it where I can be tipped quite negatively, and then I tend to kind of think, right, pick myself up, right, there are some really constructive things here. Yeah. What kind of plan can I make and how can I deal with that? I mean, I'll give you one example, which is, so I started my job, CEO of Hachette UK. I started that in January 2018. Yeah. In February 2018, it was the first release of the gender pay gap.
Yes.
That the government required all businesses, I think over 250 employees, to release that gender pay gap. So we released our gender pay gap, and there was an enormous amount of feeling about it nationally, because what it showed was that there is a big gender pay gap across a lot of the vast majority of industries, and it looks very stark. And I think particularly in book publishing, where it's a predominantly female workforce, to see that gender pay gap was particularly, I think people knew it sort of instinctively, but to see the figures, so there was a lot of anger and frustration and sort of pressure, and it did feel like this pressure bearing down on me. I was literally my second month in the role. Yeah. I've always, I suppose, counted myself as a feminist ally. I'd always, been a value that was really important to me. At the same time, I couldn't deny the fact I'm a white cis man, sitting at the top of this organization, while we're announcing this gender pay gap. So I took it very deeply. And people, I hosted like 15 workshops, hour-long workshops with different people in the business, so that people could speak in small groups about it. People were so honest. Women in particular spoke about their experiences. It was a very painful and bruising process, but at the same time, when I look back on that, it was like I wouldn't have exchanged that for anything, because it helped me to, after 15 hours of hearing about that, really, really directly, after taking it all internally, I feel like as a business, it helped us, not just me personally, but the whole board, all of us, it helped us to kind of formulate some more measures, more tangible things, like what can we do to improve this? Yeah. What can we do to reverse this? And sort of there were lots of things that we could do and that we should have done as a business before. And when I look back on that, I actually, it's funny, because at the time I thought I actually made myself ill. I remember going on holiday afterwards, and my immune system was totally broken down. I got really ill because I'd felt it as so much pressure. But now I look back on that, it's like, wow, that was the most helpful and amazing thing. If I hadn't felt under that pressure, if I hadn't felt it that deeply, we wouldn't have, you know, we're not, I want to be clear, we're not nearly where we need to be, but we wouldn't have improved things such a lot.
Yeah.
And it's sort of like, so I'm grateful for that as well as
Yeah. I love that. I love that, because that's sort of like seeing the pressure, feeling the pressure, and then leaning into it. And not necessarily being easier leaning into it, but actually the growth that I'm hearing you talk about for you as a new CEO, and also the direction of travel that you wanted to take, the culture specifically of Hachette, I understand. That was an important stretch point to go into the pressure. And I love that. I mean, did you know that instinctively, David, or did you have to really talk yourself into that? Because I can imagine people listening to this thinking, right, that I'm not sure I would have done that. you know, how long did it take you to do that?
It's a really good question. I mean, it took me a good couple of weeks, I'd say. You know, sort of, and I think that's one thing in the last 5 years specifically that I've got better at, is it's like a kind of mental pivot I do.
Yes.
Pivoting from the pain to something constructive, to kind of, you know, where do I, when, you know, how do I absorb it? I think I actually need to feel that emotion. I need to feel that stress, that upset, that pressure, and then there comes this little sort of thing in my brain of right now, how do I translate that into action? How do I get better? How do I, you know, how do I do something?
Yes.
And I suppose there's some situations where I think actually I don't think I need to do anything. I think this is unwarranted or whatever. But in the vast majority of circumstances, almost all circumstances, there's something in there.
Yeah.
There's something in there. It's like, right, what is the thing that then I can take forward and I can make this a positive experience? And actually, it helps me to write it down sometimes.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah. And what I'm hearing is that there's maybe in the past it would have been a more of an urge to respond potentially. And what I'm hearing, I think, in this example is that moment of pause, almost that moment of, like, in this case, it took 2 weeks, where you were like untangling it and understanding, you know, okay, there's a feeling, a very strong feeling, which is your first, it sounds like that's an emotional feeling, feels like that's your first signal for you, David.
Yeah.
And then it's taken some experimentation over the years as to how long that feeling sits, dormant or getting larger. Your relationship with the feeling, I think I'm hearing, is what you now do. So there's a pivot. I love this idea of a pivot point. And how long does it take for you to pivot into action on that feeling?
Yeah, and I've learned with myself as well that there's a dangerous thing was when I'm feeling that feeling, is not just to go instantly to like, how do I make those people feel better, or how do I respond to that thing? Because that's not always the constructive thing to do. And like, you know, the constructive thing in that place sometimes is just to listen to it, to absorb it, and then use it in a different way, if that makes sense.
Yes. And how have you learned to do that in a way that suits you? That relationship between the feeling and the pivot, and breaking the need or the urge to fix it or make it better?
I think that, I mean, I guess it's just, I mean, a lot of things, that's one of the pleasing things, to kind of depth of experience when you've done it more than one time. The more times you do it, I'm like, okay, I get, it's almost like a sort of warning goes off in my brain, but right, okay, you can go in different directions here. You can kind of run down this sort of emotional, or you can just sit with this for a while.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it, I mean, I have to say, COVID and post-COVID, this new experience we all have of more hybrid working is helpful for me in that respect. I think when I look back to a pre-COVID world, when I was usually in the office 5 days a week, when you're in that actual physical space, it's quite hard to take a step back and be reflective. And I think now one conscious thing I do when I'm in this place is I need to kind of retreat a little bit and spend a bit, even though it's a bit painful, spending time by yourself, because what you want to be, I think instinctively you want to be surrounded by other people telling you it's okay and whatever. But for me now, I think when I'm feeling that way, when that pressure's bearing down, I now deliberately take myself off a little bit to think about it properly. Yeah. And to kind of plan, almost like I just, it sound a bit pretentious, but I just read War and Peace. I'd never read War and Peace before, and there's so much interesting stuff there about military strategy, and it's interesting because I'm not particularly interested in military strategy. I never thought about it before, but a lot of military strategy is kind of the feedback you get, and how you take that feedback, how you think about it, how you cogitate on it. Yeah. It's not just sort of people rushing at each other with guns or whatever. And so it's almost like a sort of, it was helpful for me reading that, because I thought, well, actually that's kind of what I do at my best, I suppose, is kind of take the feedback in, sit with it, and then kind of plot the next course of action.
Yes.
Which might mean a diversion from where I thought I was going or the business was going.
Yeah, and I think this is really pertinent right now, isn't it? This idea of cogitation. I like the idea of it being a strategy to cogitate, and everyone's got a different way of cogitating. But what I'm witnessing is that people are not providing enough space for themselves to cogitate in a really thorough and useful way. And that's partly because of the environment we're all operating in, which is huge uncertainty and, volatility. But I love this process of, what does cogitation mean for somebody who is getting a sense of pressure? And also, I heard you say earlier on, David, about the writing. So I'm hearing in here, there's a process of separation, physical separation, space, reflection space. And then within that is for you writing
yeah,
out.
For me, I think there's also something, I think the other thing in the world that we maybe as a society don't talk enough about is the extent to which we've all got these with us the whole time.
Yes.
And the pressure that brings, and the almost lack of it impedes, in my view, it kind of impedes one's ability to really cogitate properly or absorb things, because the temptation is to be looking at something or sort of slightly numbing, or sort of dealing with something or whatever. So I try to make, I'm not saying I always succeed, I try to give myself time away from that.
Yes.
Pretty regularly, and during the course of a day to have time, a working day, have time away from that, because I do think that, I think it adds to the pressure. I think it adds to the feeling of always being on and always having to react rather than be able to step back at all.
Yeah, and do you consciously leave your devices somewhere? Is that a conscious choice?
Yeah, because I guess we've all got an addictive personality to some extent. I'm really bad with the phone in that, sort of if it's there, I'm quite bad in terms of looking at it. So I do have times to the working day and at the weekend where I switch it off, or I put it somewhere else or whatever. And I used to be very bad actually in meetings. And I don't take my phone into meetings now. I don't take a laptop into meetings.
Do you expect others not to do the same?
I do, and it's difficult, because part of me kind of thinks, well, sometimes people take laptops in the meeting because they need to take minutes, or they want to take notes or whatever. I do feel it impedes people's ability to be fully present, and I think it's an important. I'm trying not to sound too old-fashioned here, because I'm conscious that I come from a pre-digital age. So maybe someone from a digital age would have a different perspective on this. I suppose my perspective is that sort of balance of digital and non-digital is quite important to me. Of being physically present, mentally present, and then having that time.
It's so I really relate to that, because if I'm talking to a group or working with a team and somebody's either on their phone or for me, it does produce a sort of adrenaline in me, that, because I feel like we're not giving each other our wholeness in that moment. And even if it is a note-taking thing, it still takes people's eyes and energy out of one another, which is the connection when you've got everybody. I
actually had a one-to-one recently, and the person I had a one-to-one with doesn't normally look at their phone in a one-to-one, but it was quite an intense conversation. And then they were sort of looking at their phone, and I could see them with their phone. And I actually thought, well, I almost felt sort of, is that for them a sort of it's quite uncomfortable. Like
Yeah.
it's actually this is quite an uncomfortable conversation, or it's quite an intense conversation. And is that a way of sort of just numbing the intensity a bit, or
Yes.
getting away from it?
Yes.
Because I think that is something that we do as humans, is it kind of takes the edge off a bit, I
Yeah.
think.
Yeah.
And but equally, I think it's really important to have that edge, to have that intensity or discomfort sometimes.
Yes. True. I want to pause here for a moment to talk about the practice of cogitation and devices. How do we boss our attention when there are so many potential distractions? I was at the theatre last week and the person sitting next to me was busily texting in the first half. This really bothered me. I was irritated on behalf of the performers, I was irritated on behalf of those sitting around me, and I was irritated with myself that I was even bothered by what she was doing. Why couldn't I boss my attention and focus on the performance regardless? And before I knew it, my head was full of a dialogue that had nothing to do with the piece of theatre that I'd paid to see. This is the seduction of distraction. A lot has been written about our attention being stolen, and there's increasing research to show that a life defined by fragmented attention can increase pressure and fatigue. In fact, according to some research, the mere presence of a smartphone reduces our ability to focus, even if we're not looking at it. What David's sharing here, which I think is worth emphasising, is how devices can impede our ability to absorb what's going on now, in front of us, to be physically and mentally fully present, and as he says, be able to cogitate on what we're picking up. This might be a specific conversation or a meeting or a particular environment. Devices and cogitation rarely sit well together. Our devices increase the pressure on us to always feel on, reducing our capacity to be present with a thought, truly with it, to cogitate on it. So what can we do? David talks about how he's learnt to pivot from a difficult feeling into something that's tangible by being with it, to create a moment of choice. This might mean resisting the urge to solve it immediately or get distracted by something else. I thought it might be helpful to summarise what he's been experimenting with to create this pivot point for him. He takes himself off to deliberately cogitate, to sit with thoughts, listen to the feeling and plot the next course of action. Love the fact that he says plot. He writes, saying that it helps him work out the tangible next step, and he consciously chooses digital time and non-digital time. For example, he actively chooses not to take his phone or laptop into meetings. When the research is showing that on average we spend 3 to 4 hours a day on our phones alone, being more deliberate about what we choose to focus on and what we're modelling to others, especially in moments of pressure, is becoming increasingly important. Over the years, you are still working on the best strategy for you when you feel under pressure, to turn it into a pressure for growth rather than a pressure that's going to do you in.
Yeah, definitely. I try to, and I think it helps for me kind of thinking back to previous examples.
Yes.
And thinking, oh God, I felt at the lowest. I mean, I'll give you another example. We launched a new warehouse 4 years ago, and that was a really tough time, because when you launch a new warehouse, there are various technical things that don't work perfectly, and there was a lot of, and in our business, books going out promptly to the shops and everything, incredibly important.
Yes.
It's an incredibly important part of the business, and there will always be these sort of teething troubles with a new warehouse launch. So I'd never been through a warehouse launch before in my job as an editor. It never really prepared me for that. But it was a very, very stressful and intense time for me. But now I look back on it, it's really, these sorts of things are really helpful for me to look back on, because now our warehouse is functioning better than ever. It's brilliant. All the shops are saying good things, that our clients are saying good things, the publishers are saying good things. Like, it's great. And it sort of helps me to think back. I felt so low at that point. I felt under such pressure, but equally I'm aware that for me and the team, we were going through it together. For all of us, like, that pressure helped us a lot in terms of getting to where we are now. And it's sort of such a sort of intrinsic part of the journey now.
Yes.
That and I see that as the part of the journey of leadership generally, that I don't think, for me, I can have a kind of good journey as a leader unless I have those lows. Like, I don't think, I mean, we deal in publishing in stories, and every story, the hero's journey or any story archetype, you can't have a good story that doesn't have some real low points, and you can't have a good story where the hero doesn't feel under great pressure. So for me, I take those now as like, this is part of the journey. This is intrinsic. This is important. And I do genuinely feel like, if you'd asked me 5 years ago, I'd have a completely different response.
So what are you putting, what's different from, if you had to nail what is different from 5 years ago that allows you the freedom to have that different response, what is it?
I think for me, in the job that I'm doing, there's just it's a large, complex business, and there's always something that could cause stress in it. So for me, it's about the velocity of different challenges, and it's not like anything I'd experienced prior to that. So if you think about an arc of a year or something, the drama or the pressure, or whatever, all jobs are full of pressure or whatever, but just the number of different things that are happening all the time in this job, I suppose, has given me has just built up that sort of I don't know, shell, if or just perspective, I suppose. Built up that perspective, because there's always something happening, and you could either let it sort of drag you under, or it gives you this amazing perspective that this is how you can respond to those things. I don't know if I'm making much. No,
you are. I think what you're raising for me is this sense of also learning, because it's funny you should mention the hero's journey, because if you don't go through all those stages on the hero's journey, it can take you back to the beginning again, and you repeat the same thing over and over again. So those breakthrough moments in the hero's journey are absolutely fundamental to growth. So, I see people in my life marrying the same type of person over and over again, or falling into the same relationship over and over again, because that moment of stepping back where you say, we did that together as a team. My sense is there's some sort of collecting of the lessons, or understanding what it is, and even you reflecting back, you're reminding yourself of a lesson that takes you further forward in the hero's journey than actually repeating back to the beginning again. Does that
that's absolutely and one of the things that's really important to me, one of the pillars we've got, is growth mindset. And I find it fascinating, these two things, that people can have growth mindset where they learn from successes and failures, or they can have fixed mindset, which is to say, just an example. And I just find it fascinating with different people, where something can happen and someone will then say, I think I could have done this differently. I think this could have, if I hadn't done that, that could, and that for me is brilliant, and is sort of how you learn, it's almost like taking the trick almost seems to be like taking the emotion out of failure a bit. And being able to learn from it. Whereas often you must hear this as well from people, where there's a failure and then they'll say, oh, well, the conditions just weren't right, or this thing wasn't happening, but there's nothing about themselves.
No.
And that always really disappoints me. Like, I always think in any situation, whether it's wholly your fault or not, and maybe it's unpacking that notion of what fault is, or what, because I think we take it as humans very sort of deeply, but actually to be able to say, well, actually, if I just see that less emotion or something, and just see it as how can I learn, then it frees you again.
Absolutely. And I think that's what I'm hearing in the root of not only your own growth, or what how you've managed to shift and still are shifting your relationship with pressure, how you're also enabling that within the culture that you're building at Hachette, by having growth mindset as a pillar. But it's a habit, isn't it? It's an absolute choice. And and only a leader can model it with themselves, or they can expect it in the way that they review tough situations.
And I think the other tough thing in a corporation is trying to make failure feel safe for people, because I think a corporation is, it's a large business. There people are trying to get on. I get how there's a lot of work, and there's still a lot of work for us to do to make it a really safe environment for people to fail in. In a way, I've got a more of a luxury than a lot of other people, because I don't have people bearing down on me, sort of, if I say I've failed in something, and talk about that. I think almost, and I remember when I was more junior in the organisation, I guess it felt less safe to fail, because you knew to some extent you were being judged, and you want to be judged positively. So part of the work we're doing is quite a lot to say it's okay to fail, but the point is how you fail and what you learn from it and how you move on. That's sort of what you'll be judged on, not whether you ever fail, because we all fail constantly. But it's a fragile thing. You must see this in organizations as well.
Well, yes, yeah, absolutely. And that fine line between being very open and honest about where you are finding it tough and what you've learned through that. So, in that story of you with the gender pay gap, you leant into it and you were very honest about, we want to be better, but we need to have some conversations about that. It's how do you model? I mean, where I see this really strongly in organizations is when the leaders are open to learning themselves and are modeling that. Then it builds much more of a culture of, okay, so we can all do that. That's okay. In fact, it's expected potentially.
I mean, one thing I've learned, or I'm learning, is you're never done with this stuff. Like, you have to carry on. So I feel like, almost like, I can think about points in time where I felt like, that message has been really clear, but then it has to be constant. Like it's, and you can be set back, can't you? That's the other thing that's interesting. You can go from being what feels like quite a safe place where people feel able, and then suddenly it feels a bit unsafe because something's happened. That makes everyone retreat a little bit. So, I mean, that's the sort of fascinating thing, isn't it? That you're always you can never just sit back.
Well, you can, but you're unlikely to shift anything. It's, again, a choice, isn't it, I suppose? Do you remember, I mean, what's the worst pressure you've ever been on, or you can remember in your life, David?
The worst pressure probably is when this is when I was much younger, and I'd just been given the job running a very small company called Allison Busby, owned by a fantastic Spanish guy. He and his team were in Spain. It was a team of 6 of us in the UK. I was running that. And I was very young. I was like 23. So it felt,
wow.
It was this kind of seismic for a 23-year-old. And he obviously saw some potential or something that made him think I could do it. And it was one of those weird situations where I think he thought I could do it. I had no idea if I could do it or not. I thought I probably couldn't, but I sort of felt I had to try. I knew very little at that time. I'd only been out of university 2 years. I'd been an assistant editor, then I'd commissioned a couple of books. I knew nothing about the nuts and bolts of the business. Literally the second week, I mean, we're back to book distribution here, but literally the second week that I took over, we had this book distributor, and it was just the turn of the millennium, and it was when everyone was worried about millennium bugs. Do you remember that? And
yes.
So this distributor had completely changed its computer system in order to be millennium bug, not to have a millennium bug, but in so doing, the whole computer system had gone haywire. The second week I was up there, the distributor went into administration. It's completely ruined. All our books were stuck there. We had no way of getting them out to customers. This was in literally week 2 of me as a 23-year-old being given responsibility for something I had no idea about whatsoever. I had to then try. I was literally ringing. I looked. I think it was the Yellow Pages then. Looking in the Yellow Pages for book distributors, asking a couple of people I knew, going around book distributors. I felt under such pressure at that time because I knew how ill-equipped I was to make any of these sorts of decisions. When I look back now, obviously not obvious, but I think, wow, what an amazing experience, what an amazing learning experience. I grew so
Yeah.
much in the
Yeah.
space of a few weeks. Like, I mean, I probably learned more in the space of a few weeks than I normally would in a few years.
Yes.
But it was so intense that when you're learning at that rate, I
Mm.
remember my head used to hurt at night, like I
Yeah.
didn't have any energy for anything else. I was completely absorbed by it.
Yes.
When you said the most pressure, that's where I went to.
Yeah. 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 And even now you look back on it and see it as a massive growth moment. And I love your point about when you can look back and remember that and note to yourself, look, it felt like that, and look what happened, and look what you did. I think that's so important that we do that. Have that ability to keep stacking them up.
And it helps you, yeah, it definitely helps me in the moment. I'm in the moment of something else, thinking I'm in the moment now, but this too shall pass, like, and then
Yes.
I'll be, this too will, and it sort of hasn't, I think it hasn't failed me yet. Like I can't think of an experience. You said, is there anything, like I can't think of something where it's just been miserable and I haven't learned anything.
No. Brilliant. And how do you deal with other people's pressure? So, I mean, there are things that I know for you just don't provide pressure, but other people that you're working alongside, it is highly pressure, or it feels like a pressure for them. How, as a leader, do you manage people who are feeling pressure and you're sort of looking at it thinking, really?
Again, you know, I'm in the business, and I think this is something fortunate about being a book publisher. I'm in the business of telling stories. I'm in the
Yes.
business of narrative. And I think as a leader, how you tell the story is vitally important.
Mm.
You can have the same story and it can be told in lots of different ways. And some ways will be energizing for people, and some ways will be really demotivating. So I tend to, when there's something that's a business pressure where I know that I'm feeling calm about it,
Mm-hmm.
I tend to try to make the most of that in terms of talking about it in a way that I hope will take people around me who are feeling stressed about that thing, and they'll see how calm I am or how excited.
Mm.
I, I think often, yeah, when there's a business challenge, that can be exciting. So
Mm. For you.
I, for me, and I try to get that excitement across. And I think that is something you try to do as a leader. You try to
Yeah.
say, we've got this budget of X amount this year, and you know how you tell that story can be different. One could say, oh, we've got this budget this year. It's really scary and daunting. How will we ever be able to achieve it? Or there's the story of, we've got this budget this year. Wow, if we get to the top of that mountain, won't that be really exciting? How will we feel when we're there? That will be such an achievement. It's a real privilege to have these challenges and not to just be coasting along and just doing things that we know are easy. We need to take the mountaineering example. We need to have some kind of hard peaks to scale here. And I think those two, it's the same thing, but just really different stories, right?
Yes. Yes. And do you anticipate that, David? So do you as a leader go, right, I know that X or this team or these individuals are probably going to be looking at this coming down the line and are going to react like that. So therefore, I'm going to jump in, anticipate that. I'm just wondering how you do it, or do you just feel it when you see it?
Kind of bit of both, really. I think you can sense something in the air.
Mm.
I think businesses can sometimes be very insular and can kind of just view themselves as a sort of, you know, just a totally self-contained thing. But actually, not in my experience, often businesses are reacting to the outside world and what's going on. So if I look back at the last few years for me, a lot of what's gone on internally is as a response to what's going on externally.
Yeah.
And most recently, you know, some of the recessionary pressures, the cost of living, that, you know, kind of these things affect us as a business, and they affect us psychologically as humans as well.
Yeah.
So I tend to try to kind of spend a lot of time thinking about what's the mood in the air, and what do I need to do to kind of help steer people through this. I'll give
Yes.
you another example. Actually, with COVID,
Yeah.
it was a really there were so many different phases to it. And there was one phase when I remember just waking actually in the middle of the night and thinking, what people really need right now is a feeling of some sort of certainty. There's such uncertainty here, but it felt right to me that from me and others in the business that we were able to provide some certainty. And so that was kind of almost like a little project for those few weeks. It's like, we're going to come with some specific details about specific things that are happening or that we're doing, because that felt like the need. There was another point during COVID when I kind of felt like people want to be listened to. People are quite frustrated or angry. They need to be listened to. So then there was like kind of a stepping back moment of kind of like, we're listening. But you can't. It's so interesting. I find it so fascinating with a business that the mood is always shifting, and what I think as a leader, it's trying to steer this course, isn't it? Between having some constant principles and some constant things, like I said, growth mindset is one of our pillars, like some unshifting things, but then some tonal things that do shift and aren't too rigid based on how people are, what the mood is.
Yes, and presumably you've got your team on the lookout for that. So I like to call them sort of your court jesters. You know, who are your court jesters that have got an ear to the ground to understand, particularly in the hybrid world, how people are? Because it was easier to pick that up, I feel, when everybody was in the office all the time. What I'm hearing now is it's much harder, because not only have you got the global aspect, but you've also got people not regularly connecting in the way that they used to, in a different way.
One really important thing for me, actually, you said the court jester thing, is actually, because I think that's a real trap potentially for leaders, is having 2 or 3 people that they really trust and rely on to give them feedback. And that's good, but I've seen other leaders, when I was more junior, I've seen other leaders where that feedback, to my mind, has been flawed or partisan or whatever. So for me, like, part of my sort of focus is really like, how do I get as much feedback as possible from as broad a range of the business, from all levels of it, in as honest and unfiltered way, and not to be relying on those, you know, those couple of trusty lieutenants or my assistant or whatever, which is where I've seen I've seen it as a trap. I don't know if you see it like a trap of leadership can be that it is quite isolated. You don't have, and then you become increasingly reliant on these few sources, and that for me there's a personal danger in that. So I try to keep that feedback as broad as possible.
Interesting.
Because like different bits of the business can be experiencing things in wholly different ways. And we've had it. So we had someone on the team who was very mainly dealing with a sort of senior management, and she gave me some feedback like, everyone's feeling this way. I'd had strategy sessions directly with a lot of junior members of the team that same week. We'd had like workshops and strategy sessions, and I knew they were feeling a totally different way. And it was kind of important to know both those things. The senior management was feeling this way, the junior management was feeling a different way, but I wouldn't want to not have either of those bits of feedback.
Talking of feedback, I remember receiving a message on Facebook from an ex-student of mine who I taught about 20 years ago. And the message said, "Hi miss, glad I found you here. I really enjoyed our lessons, but I was one of the quieter ones and you never asked me my opinion. I wish you had." I think about this a lot when I reflect on feedback. And in hindsight, I wish I'd been braver and been more open about how I could improve as a teacher to help them improve and learn faster. To model that learning never stops. It's lifelong. Learning faster is particularly vital in this current environment, to keep adapting. I love the question David asks himself. How do I get as much feedback as possible in an honest and unfiltered way, and not just rely on a few people in my team? What a great question. In medieval times, the court jester was an entertainer with a unique role of offering candid feedback, sharing perspectives and insights that otherwise the king or the queen may not have known. And what David's reminding us of here is so crucial. Who are we asking? Who do we rely on? How might that become limiting? In my opinion, one way of getting feedback that can guarantee difference of opinion is to make it open and attributable. Go to the people whose views you might fear. Be brave. Regular review and seeking feedback are vital ingredients in becoming better at anything. Self-awareness on its own can be very unreliable. Who do we have in our lives to help us grow? After every rehearsal, actors are given notes from the director and expected to work on them before the next rehearsal. In sport, the coach gives the athlete feedback after training to improve their performance. The current environment is pulling us all to go faster, and what David is highlighting here is the importance of slowing down to keep learning, to be brave and to ask a range of people. This doesn't mean we have to act on all the feedback, but it models to everyone that we're open to learning and taking on feedback from a range of sources as a crucial part of our own personal growth and improvement, however senior and whatever the pressure. And that's important for your pressure valve, isn't it, David? Because as you said at the very beginning of this conversation, the way people are feeling matters to you.
Yeah, and like, I mean, we've all done, I suppose, our Myers-Briggs profiles, and I'm definitely a sort of F person rather than a T person. So, and I know that about myself. And so actually it is quite important to that point. I've got some people I work with who are much more thinking, analytical people rather than sort of intuitive feeling people. And it's important for me to spend time with them at moments of pressure to pull myself back, because I know a danger for me as well. I can go way too deep into feelings.
Yeah.
I can think of a specific example. I was in Australia and I was on a business trip and I was down a real rabbit hole of feelings and emotions and then pressure. And I was with a colleague who's much more in the sort of thinking, analytical phase. And he just said to me, look, David, this thing is all actually fine. You don't need to stress about it quite as much. And that just one statement for me, because I trust him, and it was hugely important for me.
Yeah.
To be pulled back a bit away, so being pulled back from some of the rabbit holes I can go down.
Yeah. And that's where somebody close at hand is helpful, isn't it? To notice that that's the sort of thing you do. So just look out for it, because it's helpful if you can see me going down into this emotional rabbit hole. Yeah. And I suppose that's why I rely on people close to me in the business more so than the feedback thing, or it's feedback about how I can be better, probably. Yes. So if you were to say, what are your non-negotiables for you remaining as at the top of your game, I suppose, David, in this current environment? Where you stand now with all of the learning that you've had over the years? What would you say your non-negotiables for you to perform at your best?
One thing I learned was such a learning experience over the COVID lockdown is that I'm definitely an omnivert. So for me to succeed, and it's probably the number one, I'm coming to it first because it's the number one thing, I need the right mixture of human contact and time by myself. If I have too much time by myself, that's really bad for me. I don't function at my best. If I have too much time with other people and not enough time by myself, I don't function at my best. So I'm quite sort of rigorous about how I structure my diary now, is to have enough.
How do you do that? Yeah.
By being, quite prescriptive, I suppose, with my assistant about how we organize things. So I almost always work from home on a Friday, because I know that having, and I crack through a lot that day, and I do a lot of thinking and I do a lot of reflecting and I write lots of notes. So I always do that. And this is something I think you taught me, like I try never to have back-to-back meetings during the week. I try to have some time at my desk by myself where I can. But equally, I know then it's like a sort of alchemic balance, and everyone's got their own thing. I actually know now that I need to have a certain number of work social things every week.
Yes.
I need, publishing is a very lunching business. I absolutely love that. I actually need probably to be doing 3 or 4 lunches a week, because I need that social energy. I need that external energy. I need to be doing some stuff in the evening. I need to be seeing friends. So it's this weird sort of mix for me. But I feel like I need that. And when I look back at previous times when I've felt depleted, I've either felt depleted because I've had too much. I can think of, like, there was a trade fair where I was out 5 nights in a week, and I was busy during all the days, and I've never felt as sort of low or as shattered or as depressed at work. And that's too much contact. But then equally during COVID, I felt incredibly low. I was one of the people probably who struggled most being home all the time, away from other people. I need to be around people. So for me, the principle, I mean, I always feel like that's the principal thing. If I have that right balance, then I feel I can function pretty well by my own standards as a leader. Yeah. I think there's other things I know. I need to sleep right, I need to eat right, I need to exercise, all of those things. But like that almost for me comes naturally when I've got that balance.
Interesting. Yeah. I love that you now know. And I so relate to that, David. I can look at my diary and sort of by the shape of it, know that if it's good shape or slightly over one side or slightly over the other. And I can sort of see it just by the shape of it on the page. It's really weird. And I think it's so important that leaders have that idea of what is a good week for them and what is a good space for them. And I've got a couple of other clients who really need this external connection in order to feel basically vibrant and potent in their role as CEO. That their ratio is how much of my week is internal and how much of my week is actually reaching out externally and understanding the world. And that's different for each person. But I think what I'm hearing here, which I really think is helpful, is in order for us to be better under pressure and really evolve and grow through it, we have to know what the shape of our time, this alchemic balance, I love that word, of what works for you. And unless we step away and keep looking at it and thinking, right, is what I was doing last month, last year, 2 years ago still working for me now? If we don't have that rigor, we're missing a trick, I think.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the other, am I allowed one more thing, or is that
go ahead.
one thing? Okay. I think the other thing that's so crucial for me is that work doesn't feel like work.
How do you do that? How do you do that?
So I think, okay, so for me, like the best times I have at work, and actually to be fair, that's a lot of the time I have at work, is when it just feels like fun. It feels like something I want to be doing. So I think for me, fun, I know it sounds, I don't know, it's not, work as fun is really important to me.
Yeah.
And I suppose that means for me, working around people who don't take things too seriously and who I can laugh with. I think laughter is really important. I think I've never read, we publish loads of business. I've never read one about laughter in the workplace, but for me, it's so important. And I'm sure for lots of other people as well. It just helps me. It's just like being, it just helps keep it fun. And yes. I know when I'm with actually, I'll give you an example. When I was very young, Allison, this company, Allison Busby, very small company, when I was looking around warehouses, and there was one guy who was showing us around, and it was like a 3-hour tour, and he was so serious, and he didn't crack a smile the whole time. I mean, he was also quite patronizing, and sort of was thinking, what's this 23-year-old doing, kind of. And I was like, I couldn't. Well, even though actually on paper that probably would have been a better warehouse for us to go to, I knew I couldn't forge any kind of relationship with him because I couldn't have any fun with him.
Yeah. So
I think, I'm not saying everyone has to be all kind of raucous the whole time or kind of making jokes, but for me, that feeling of like, and for me, it gives me positivity, energy, optimism, all of those things. And it makes me kind of bounce out of bed in the morning. So working with people who have, who can have a sense of humor. And I think also you do go through some quite dark times
Mm.
in business or in senior
Mm.
leadership.
Mm.
Having some people that you can be humorous with, it helps. I think it helps so much when there's a difficult time if there's some humor there.
I
Even some
agree.
gallows humor, it's really helpful.
I totally agree. In fact, we've had quite a few people on the podcast. I remember Julie Harris from Comparison Technology. She said, we've got to laugh. Laughter is really important to her. I think there's a lot of people where that's very important. And there's a lot of science behind, the power of laughter and the power of a smile when you're under stress. And, your brain can't manage being stressed and also you smiling. It's like, it goes, what? And it's good if you can do nothing else, just smile on top of a worry.
Yeah.
It's sort of like goes,
it just calms you, doesn't it?
It
has a sort of endorphin effect or something.
Yeah, absolutely.
So for me, that's a non-negotiable, actually, I think.
For you. Yeah.
For me, yeah.
Yeah. And do you share that with the people that you work with? So in terms of your non-negotiables and how they'll get the best out of you, is this sort of part of how people know? Obviously your assistant knows that because she puts you at home on a Friday, but do other people that you work with know what these non-negotiables are for you?
I think so. I think more so now post-COVID than pre-COVID. I think it opened up a lot of more honest conversations about that. And I think I felt more able to be, I think pre that as well, I felt in quite a cliched way, I felt I need to be in the office 5 days a week. I am this sort of leader. I just need to take it on the chin. Like kind of that's what you need to do. And I didn't, I suppose during that experience of COVID, and maybe that experience of having done it for a few more years and feeling that actually I can do it a bit more in my own, I can do it in my own way. I don't have to be a cliche. Like I can have that space. And I think leaders, increasingly are freed up to do things in their own way. I think that's one brilliant development over the last few years. And seeing some of the examples come from West Coast US as well, that it's not always a man in a suit or kind of people have different styles. So I think increasingly I have been a lot more honest about sort of, I need my space now, and now I need to do something social. Yes. And now let's get together, and now let's be apart. Yes.
And the other thing that I know you've said to me is very important to you, increasingly so, David, is this voice outside of Hachette. These conversations that you want to stimulate or be part of, regarding what's happening in the world with books and publishing, and you've always said that purpose beyond just one place and having a sort of wider impact in your position has been important to you.
It is really important, and I've done the last couple of years, I suppose. So we kind of take it in turns, but for last year I was president of the Publishers Association, and that was really interesting and exciting, spending more time with politicians and talking about what books are, what they do. I think I feel lucky. I feel genuinely lucky because it's a business that I went into because I love books, and then I found out I love the business as well, and I love business full stop. But it's brilliant to be able to go out in the world and talk about, books are doing better than ever, like sales are going up, kind of more people are reading, teenagers are reading more, TikTok, 5% of TikTok interactions are about books. There's all this amazing stuff out there that people don't necessarily know about. So there's almost like maybe I have to stop myself sometimes, but it's almost I have a kind of evangelical quality about it. Even when I'm with friends, to kind of be like, look, books are amazing. I can't think of anything else that is such a kind of conversation starter in the world. As books. And that are as kind of culturally potent, and commercially strong as well. So yeah, absolutely. I love getting out of the business or out of the industry and sort of evangelizing about it, really.
Yeah. And I mean, what's so wonderful is I can feel it across now. Like, you've that phrase of popping out, you've just completely popped out in the last. I mean, you popped out anyway, David, but there's something about when people touch what really matters to them, it is so contagious. And I think that's so important when, you know, there is pressure, yes, but if we can just really find ways to connect to the things that light us up, it's another force, isn't it? It's magnetic.
Yeah, and actually, conversely, I love being around people from other industries who are passionate about their businesses and hearing
Yes.
about that, and then trying to bring some of that energy back. And here, and you know, there's a lot of studies done. Well, you'll know this on creativity and how it's essentially about making connections between disparate things. And that's another thing I love going out in the world is like I was having a conversation with a guy who runs a lottery firm in the US, and he was talking about like how they measure customer behavior, how they analyze customers. It's like there was so much I was taking from him that was like, oh, we can really apply this to book publishing as
Yes.
well. And sort of that's exciting. I find that exciting. Maybe
Yeah.
that's another non-negotiable way, like kind of being able to go and like hear different things, and then bring them,
Yeah.
like kind of magpie, kind of bring them back to.
Yes. Yes. And it's what you said when you were reading War and Peace, that, you know, you're taking things from that into your own way of managing yourself and leading.
And I think, you know, and I think it's been really helpful for me working with writers, creative people, and looking at the way they take ideas from around the world and use that to inform what they're writing. And I think as business people, we do the same, really. Like, you know, you're taking bits from everywhere, and that for me is the exciting thing. And hearing different things and kind of finding different tools in different places, that's and I guess creativity is really important to me. Like being creative at work is very important.
Yes, and it seems like that's a way into managing a problem or a pressure for you, is to be creative with it. Like all those examples you've shared are not necessarily the obvious response.
I think I'm at my worst when there's a rule book. And when someone says, and actually I know this about myself generally, is that I cannot follow a recipe. Like I love to cook, but I cannot follow a recipe. I will not follow a recipe. So kind of, I know I'm at my worst when there's like, here is a sort of Bible of what you must do.
Yeah.
These are detailed instructions, follow them. Yeah. I'm terrible. Like I'm not popping out at all. I would be the opposite of popping out.
Yes.
And I think I'm at my best when there's no rule book. And actually that was what I found with the COVID experience was, it was really, but incredibly liberating and exciting in lots of ways. What's been very difficult in other ways, but kind of as a leader, actually the rule book's all ripped up. What can be more exciting than that?
Yes. Oh, I love that. And now I've got a whole new nickname for you, which is Magpie. I think that's so good, that Magpie idea. So David, I always finish these conversations by asking my guest what would be 2 pay forwards. If there was somebody listening to this podcast and they wanted to be better under pressure, what would be your 2 pay forwards as an offer to them?
I think one would be very deliberate when you are under pressure about thinking. Actually, one very practical thing that I did in the first year that I was CEO was I actually made a list on my phone of proud achievements.
We love that.
Things that I think probably prompted by you, Sara, like kind of things where I've been where it's been tough, but we'd got through it in a positive way and I'd learned from it. And I literally made a list. And that's one thing I would say to people. Actually make a list on your phone of things where you've triumphed, you've got through it, you've learned, you failed and you've learned, or you've succeeded and you've learned. And then when next time you're going through it, actually just look at that list, actually look at that physical list. And it does have for me, has an amazing ability to connect me to, okay, I may be feeling under pressure at this moment. There might be this difficult thing happening, but I know from all these previous examples that I've learned from it. I've got through it. The business has, become stronger as a result. That's, for me, that's really powerful.
When you write it, David, do you have a way of writing it, or do you free write? I'm just really curious about how do you log those proud moments over the years?
I just actually have it in the notes section on my iPhone,
Yeah.
and I just write them as just statements like, trying to think of the first year, kind of, did town hall successfully, or, warehouse move difficult but got through it, or whatever, kind of just quite short statements.
Yes. Yes. So underneath it, how and what you did, but the trigger is the statement that you did. That was the situation and you got through it.
And I suppose then when I read it, I just go back mentally to that whole situation.
Yeah.
I don't need for me, I don't need all the context or anything like that. I just think, oh yeah, that was horrible and now it's great. So
yes. Yeah, great. Thank you. And your second one would be?
My second one would be, I had I think a really key thing for me, again, is like perspective. But perspective is one of the hardest things. When people say it's not the end of the world, but it can feel like the end of the world. And there was, for me, I try and keep in mind again. I mean, I guess it's similar to the other one, particular moments. There's one particular moment, I mentioned mountains earlier. I love mountains, and but it was one day my husband was ill, so normally we go walking together, and we were in the Alps, and but I had to go walking by myself. So I did this really long walk up a mountain by myself, and I felt, for whatever reason, this incredible just calmness at the top, and this feeling of perspective, and this feeling of just, I wouldn't say I'm a calm person, but at that moment I felt incredibly zen, incredibly calm. I felt like I understood where everything sat in relation to each other. That sort of, it's really hard to describe that feeling, but just this absolute sense of like centeredness and calmness and mindfulness and all of those things. And that actually, again, like that, I think almost consciously, whenever I'm under pressure, I think back to that particular mountain, to sitting at the top of it, looking across all the other. I think there is something about mountains that brings perspective. Anyway, but like for me, that particular moment. So I think if there is a moment when you've ever felt like that, like whether it's by the sea or mountain, kind of, whatever, I think often it is in nature in some respect, or the kind of a moment when you just felt really still and really calm and really at peace. Just thinking back, because I can almost like smell it, I can feel it, it was years ago, but I can remember what the snow felt like. I can remember everything, and that for me, taking myself back, makes me feel, even now talking about it, I feel a lot calmer. So I think if there is a moment for that would be my other kind of play it full kind of, if there's a moment for you like that, kind of when you are feeling at maximum pressure, things are really busy, kind of putting your phone down, just thinking back to that moment. What did it feel like? What did it smell like? What did it look like?
Yeah. I love that, David. Thank you. How great talking to you.
Well, vice versa. I always love talking to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, David. I really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's been great.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Better Under Pressure with me, Sara Milne Rowe. If you enjoyed it, please do subscribe and let us know what you found useful or what you'd like to know more about. Our aim is to share as many examples as possible of what people do to manage pressure for better. If you're interested in any of the practices mentioned, check out my book, The Shed Method. Alternatively, you can find us at Coaching Impact or me on LinkedIn and Instagram. Better Under Pressure was produced by the fab team at Smart Cookie Media. Thanks so much for listening, and until next time, goodbye.